School of Education. And I welcome you all to our Graduate School of Education's semester-long colloquium series. This is the second guest speaker we've had this year. I will not be introducing her, but I have to say a few words about our esteemed guest today, Professor Micah Pollack. We go back a long way. And so I'm really excited to have her here at Berkeley GSE. We were supposed to have had her back in the spring as a part of our colloquium experience, but as you know, all of our lives were radically changed as we prepared to succumb to the shelter in place because of the coronavirus pandemic. So she has graciously agreed to be a part of our colloquium series here this fall. And I am going to turn it over to our own Rebecca Chong, who is the executive director of our leadership programs, to actually introduce her formally. But I just wanted to say a hearty welcome to everyone. It's really great to see such a healthy attendance for the GSE colloquium. As Professor Pollack says, I know how hard it is when there are so many Zoom events, but it's wonderful to have this array of different folks from across our community here. So I hope you'll enjoy this presentation. I'm certainly looking forward to it myself. It's been a long time since I've heard my friend present. And I'll turn it over to Rebecca to introduce her. And then the next voice you'll hear after Rebecca will be Professor Micah Pollack of the University of California, San Diego. Rebecca.
Thank you, Dean Carter. And first, let me thank Lloyd Goldwasser for all of his work behind the scenes in organizing this GSE colloquium series. It's a really special time for our school to be able to get together, including with alumni and professors and students all together. And welcome to our special guest. I want to just share a little bit of background that might help to connect your work as an introductory point into today's discussion. First, let me just acknowledge, I want to just acknowledge all of the working educators that are with us today. My Zoom says there are 87 participants. If you are, and I'm looking in the participant bar, if you are a working educator of any type, please raise your hand under participants so we can see who you are, so we can see how many of you there are, and so that we can celebrate your presence with us in this discussion and with this topic. I see a lot of graduates of PLI and also teacher education. Thank you so much for being with us and for spending your time with us today. So in the spring of last year, in 2020, Dean Carter asked me for speaker suggestions. She was specifically interested in speakers who would be of interest to professional program students, to working teachers and leaders. And as the director of then the Principal Leadership Institute, and now the leadership programs, I suppose she decided that I might have some ideas. And so one of my first suggestions was Dr. Micah Pollack. And her eyes lit up and she said, Dr. Micah Pollack, I know her. I can ask her to come down, no problem. And so I'm sorry that it didn't happen in the spring, but we are so happy that you are here. To give you a little background on why your name rose so quickly to the top of my list, is to tell you a little bit about your publications and how they have influenced generations of students in the Principal Leadership Institute. From Color Mute, Race Talk Dilemmas in an American School, to Everyday Racism, Getting Real About Race in School, to Schooltalk, Rethinking What We Say and Do About and to Students Every Day. Your research has contributed to foundational readings in our program of teacher leaders who are preparing to become school and system leaders. For example, in spring of 2020, during the same time period when we'd hoped that you would attend in person, our students were taking a Data for School Improvement class that I was teaching along with Doug Kleinhentz, a practicing principal who is somewhere among our 92 now participants today. Hello, Doug. And we have an assignment called Having Hard Conversations Using Data. It's predicated by an assignment called Having Hard Conversations. This one just in the data format. And your book, Schooltalk, served as a foundational resource for the planning of our students. Specifically, the Guide to Talking Effectively with Colleagues was used in the design of their Having Hard Conversations presentations. Many of those students from PLI Cohort 20 have taken time out of their busy schedules to be here today to meet you. Their honor to connect a researcher with her work and to connect with their daily work. I won't read your entire bio, but I just wanted to note that this really indicates for us the testament of in your own words, how you refuse efforts to divide theory from practice and how you instead tap your research skills to help educators improve schools. Indeed, that has been true here at the Berkeley GSE, and we are so honored to hear from you and all that you have done after Schooltalk, which we know you will also discuss today. I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't read at least part of your bio. So I've truncated it since everyone could read the flyer. But to say that, just to say a few words about Dr. Pollock, an anthropologist by training. She's a professor of education studies and the director of the Center for Research on Educational Equity, Assessment, and Teaching Excellence at the University of California, San Diego. Pollock's nationally recognized work emphasizes educators' crucial role in daily efforts for anti-racism and pinpoints the key role of language in educators' work. Her newest project, designed with educator partners, US versus hate, or I suppose us versus hate, we'll hear which one it is, or maybe it's both, engages educators and students in proactive dialogues. Thank you so much for being here today. We truly look forward to engaging with you. And as a final warm welcome, let's give everybody, let's join me in giving a warm GSE welcome, unmute at the same time, and give a short welcome before we begin.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Super warm. I really appreciate that. And I'm really honored, Rebecca, by what you're saying, because those results are really what I'm going for. And so I really appreciate you starting off with them. So Lloyd is going to share the screen for me. So every once in a while, you're going to hear me call out to Lloyd. It's because I want to look at some notes about each slide so that I think about what I want to say. You want to share the screen? Great. I guess you can put it on presenter view if you want to, but that works for me because there aren't any notes under yours. So fabulous. Thanks, Lloyd. So as I already said, I'm an anthropologist of education. I study everyday activity in schools using an ethnographic toolkit. I've been focused on the role of language in educators' work for several decades now. I've had various roles in the field. Beyond being an anthropologist, I've been a teacher, I've been a civil rights worker. I have studied work I've done as a professor, as a center director. And I'm always thinking about how people in education communities, diverse communities, conflicted communities talk as they struggle to collaborate in supporting students. And I would say just as that I have made a really explicit turn in my work over the decades to design. I would say where I started with Color Mute, and also my second book, Because of Race, which was a sort of post facto look at work I did in the Office for Civil Rights of the US Department of Ed. I was really studying race and racism issues kind of as is, which is what anthropologists often typically do. And I've made a real turn over the years to participatory design, where I'm designing talk tools directly for use, as Rebecca described, by educators, but also studying them in use so that I can tweak them, improve them. So I've been working not only on books, but on public action projects. I'll describe it is us versus hate, though we are going for that double entendre there. Conversation starters, digital tools. I have a Facebook group. I'm trying a lot of mechanisms to engage educators. And I've been probably since coming to Southern California, driving more than I ever did when I lived on the East Coast, been thinking about the idea of the on-ramp. And that is the sort of metaphor for today. I've been thinking about talk tools I'm designing as on-ramps because they offer educators and increasingly students these structured invitations to join and then sustain anti-racist effort where they work. So Lloyd, if you want to go forward to our next slide, that would be great. So by an on-ramp, you should see a image of an on-ramp here. I mean a structured invitation to enter collective efforts. Let's see, I still see the first slide, Lloyd, if you want to move us forward. We got it?
Is that working now?
I'm still on the first slide with you, Lloyd. I think you need to advance to the next one.
I have advanced. Let me see.
While he's getting, picture an on-ramp, picture an image of an on-ramp in front of you right now. There we go. Thank you, Lloyd. And so I mean this, this structured invitation to join collective work. So you think about how an on-ramp enters a highway. Right now I'm thinking the highway, the rushing highway is anti-racism and equity effort. If you think about people going in a shared direction, that's the image I'm going for here. And an on-ramp, I'm arguing, is some kind of tool that offers language or a concept or action steps that prompt people to enter where they are. It might be a book, it might be a tool, it might be a frame. And I've been leaning on the framing literature increasingly in my work. Lakoff is somebody we all know in the UCs. That language, which we often call framing, is a key tool for inviting people into analysis or collective effort because it focuses our attention. So a frame like Black Lives Matter is a frame that puts attention on issue A as opposed to issue B. And I have tried different frames in my work. So that's part of what I'm going to share today. Everyday Anti-Racism, 2008. Equity as an on-ramp in 2017. An anti-hate effort since the election. I'm arguing that a focus for analysis can be an on-ramp too. So Schooltalk and a lot of my projects, as Rebecca already mentioned, invite people into the work by asking people to think about how we talk. So all of these things can be an on-ramp. If you go to the next slide, Lloyd, that would be great. So this is a sort of earlier metaphor that I wanted to honor here from Beverly Tatum. And I met Tatum in the hallway. She actually contributed a piece to Everyday Anti-Racism, which I'll mention in a minute. But I met her when I was working on that book. And at the time, she described her vision here of racism as kind of this rushing river going in one direction. And anti-racism being somebody having to swim upstream against that rushing river. In her 1997 book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, she framed it as like a moving walkway at the airport, like a conveyor belt, where anti-racism requires somebody to sort of walk in reverse at a faster speed than everybody else, going the other direction. And what I thought is really interesting about, and that I resonate with very much about this metaphor, is the idea that passive racist behavior, even if you're just standing still on the conveyor belt, the sort of 600 years of history that is pushing in one direction sort of moves you toward racism, even if you're not intending to, so that you need to make overt anti-racist effort, or else you'll be carried along. And this theoretical frame of everyday action that is very proactively refusing the reproduction of structural inequality, sort of the anti-work, has been a theme in my work for a long time, everyday anti-racism, and also this new project that is about anti-hate. It's about active repair, refusing passivity, work by all of us and everyday folks. I think the most common frame on anti-racism right now is of course Ibram Kendi's work, and he comes down very hard in that project for policy as sort of the ultimate anti-racist effort. When I read that very important work, I'm thinking all the time about everyday anti-racist behavior, because who votes for policy X, who enacts policy Y? And so the on-ramp vision is the idea of a lot of people sort of joining this work collectively as in our everyday behaviors. And the on-ramp is really this invitation to collective work as opposed to sort of the lone individual running against foot traffic. So we can go to the next slide, Lloyd, that would be great. A lot of people right now, we had an amazing, we are in the middle of an amazing movement for racial justice. And there's sort of a feeling that of a lot of people getting on the highway right now in a sense of anti-racism. This important image sparked me to use it in a piece I wrote this summer called While You Read, that was about saying, you know, let's not stop just with the reading list or the sort of the great book that you have found. And I particularly targeted this one, which I don't do in all of my work, to white people newly entering this work of anti-racism. But the real quest here to sort of keep going in the anti-racist direction when one starts reading something, and to really applying anti-racism where we work. I did meetups this summer with a lot of educators I've met through my Schooltalk Facebook group. And a lot of people were talking about, you know, these sort of summers of invigorated reading, but really wanting the ultimate holy grail being to apply this work to making anti-racist change. And also this sort of, you know, reality of people in their own book clubs, et cetera, sort of heading back into school faculties with people who are not necessarily on board and needed to be pulled into the work. So this idea of the on-ramp resonated with lots of folks as an invitation to bring people not only into reflecting and rethinking race issues in our own lives, in our society, but also on-ramps that get us refusing to participate in racism, and particularly that get us repairing racism where we work. And that kind of daily repair is where a lot of my work has situated itself. Lloyd, can you go to the next slide? So when I'm thinking about an on-ramp, I'm thinking about something that really does need to be designed, whether it's how you write a book, whether it's how you structure a tool you're giving educators, whether you're designing professional development and how that is designed. And I'm thinking a lot about how people, like I said, choose and design sort of frames for use where they work. So when I talked to educators this summer, people were in this moment of choosing invitation language for folks that they worked with in various communities across the country. Some people were using the frame or the language, the on-ramp of equity, of inclusion, diversity, anti-bias, culturally responsive teaching.
Yes.
Folks were using frames and language of anti-racism, of social justice, of abolition. Somebody needs to mute there if you don't mind. I get it. We all live this. Some using, you know, white supremacy culture as an on-ramp, and, you know, people were really struggling with which language they were going to choose. And I think this is a core tension. I like to name core tensions in work, which is, you know, something raised by a lot of folks right now, certainly by Robin DiAngelo with the book White Fragility. Paul Gorski has talked about equity detours, both of these ideas being asking whether it's kind of coddling people too much, in a sense, to find language to say the same thing, but in a language that folks resonate with or find familiar or want to join. I think this is a core tension because I think sometimes it can be really strategic and important to use language that people are familiar with or are not immediately defensive about. My daughter had to write some kind of essay this summer, and she described me had to describe me as an ice cream flavor, and she described me as salted caramel core ice cream, which I loved, and her take on that was the idea of, you know, you start eating this flavor, she said, and you're sort of like, yeah, I agree with this flavor. And then all of a sudden, pow, you get this intense thing in the core. And I think in some ways that's how I write and how I frame work as well. At times I'm trying to say in a very clear-eyed, unapologetic way, I'm trying to make arguments for how racial inequality or racism works. And sometimes I hide the vegetables in certain kinds of language that people will eat without knowing. Sometimes I'm very head-on in the way I talk about an issue, but I'm never toning down, in a sense, the points I'm making about race and racism. But I do choose frames and language at different moments to entice dissenters, the non-choir, and that has been kind of key to my work, even while I also am really trying to support people who are already sort of in the fast lane of anti-racism. And so if you go to the next slide, Lloyd, just to, you know, finish milking this metaphor, I'm gonna just make a few last points about it, which is that I think an on-ramp helps us think about how we actually don't do this work alone, that we have to get on the rushing highway with lots of other people. that there are people who are in the fast lane already, that there are people who are driving very slowly into the slow lane, but that no matter what your sort of speed is, you have to take this on-ramp every time you enter the highway because we have to do this work with other people. We can't do this work by ourselves. And so I do try to design tools for multiple people to take together with the understanding that groups actually make change together and that leaders ideally are driving the bus or at least on the bus, organizing the shared transportation so that we're not doing this alone. So next slide, want to share 3 on-ramps today, just briefly to sort of go through the different ones that I have, or some different on-ramps I have worked on designing. Each one is really a talk tool that gets people into dialogue to reflect and repair racial inequality. And you'll see this pro-con line along the bottom of many of these slides. And that's because as a designer of these tools for anti-racism, I do a lot of self-critical reflection myself about the pros and cons of how they get used. So that's really going to be the rest of my talk, is thinking very honestly with you about the pros and cons of my own efforts at sort of getting people into or inviting people collectively into anti-racism. And I will be sharing data on folks using each one of these on-ramps. So the next slide, Lloyd, thanks. Prudence is in this on-ramp. She's one of the drivers. Invited in the end about 70 folks to write. The design of this text was very short conversation starter essays to be used in pre-service, to be used in service. And the focus of Everyday Anti-Racism was really daily anti-racist action. My anthropological work on the world sort of as is, as I mentioned, color mute showed a lot of people silent and confused about, when speaking racially was racist or not. My book, Because of Race, had a lot of people getting very defensive about being bad people when they were accused of racial discrimination, and then sort of refusing to analyze the effects of their actions. And so Everyday Anti-Racism put the frame right on our everyday actions and asked people to think about the consequences of them for young people. So I very explicitly tried to sort of head off resistance at the pass in the introduction of this book and said, this book is not designed to get you to ask whether you're a bad person. It's designed to get you to ask if your everyday acts promote a more equitable society. And I think that this focus on everyday actions, I'll mention later a sort of study of Schooltalk in use, but I'll just flag here that I think it's interesting as we think about anti-racist PD, professional development or in-service, that we don't always necessarily put attention on everyday action. We grapple with big ideas, big concepts, big personal stories, and we need to do all those things. But I think the core tension is applying it to our everyday work in schools, who we discipline, what books we read, how we grade, etc. Who gets which resources. And so Everyday Anti-Racism turned our attention to that. Next slide. A key talk tool that I developed for Everyday Anti-Racism, and also in actually teaching this book in draft form, was this line. I think we called it a number line in Everyday Anti-Racism, but it's really about trying to say this constant pro-con critical reflection on the consequences of what we're doing in education and in schools. And this sort of pro-con analysis on our everyday teaching, our actual work, I would say that research argues it's a core facet of professional development in any content area, but it's often, oddly, not always sort of central to our efforts related to race and racism. So this talk tool is very important to Everyday Anti-Racism, and actually you used it again in Schooltalk. Next slide. Did several studies of people taking this on-ramp, so using Everyday Anti-Racism, so you can see Everyday Anti-Racism heading on the highway there on top of one of the cars, and did 2 studies with doctoral students of real-time professional development use by me in my own classes at the Harvard Ed School, which is, I think a classic, study design with pros and cons to it in our own classrooms. Use participant observation, journal analysis, particularly to look at real-time reactions of folks using this book, and wrote 2 papers collectively about the need to name core tensions in the middle of doing PD on race and racism to keep people engaged so that they wouldn't just sort of sit there stuck in them, but they would rather realize they were scripted, very common tensions. One of them being that people in work on race as educators are often grappling, as I've been saying, with the sort of abstract or big idea and the sort of concrete, what can I do? And that anti-racism work is really about both. We can't jump right to actions without doing the deep work on anti-racism and big ideas, big histories. Also that a lot of educators were grappling with this core tension of what can I do? Meaning a structural inequality that is truly centuries old and core to our nation's opportunity distribution, and the fact that as an educator, it's my job to challenge that through everyday anti-racism on a daily basis. Both of those things are true at the same time, and so naming that core tension was really important. Ended up designing a dialogue model that's also in Schooltalk, the principle, strategy, try tomorrow, so that people leaving a conversation name something for use at each of those levels, so that we're working with the big idea and the very concrete try tomorrow thing to do. Also notice in a second paper, caricature and hyperbole with colleagues listed there, that in these kinds of pre-service trainings or courses, a lot of people were really caricaturing the ask of anti-racism as if it were, we call them, the people were hearing phantom demands that we weren't actually making, that people were hearing almost a request to constantly address racial flare-ups in their class, even if they taught physics. So, so it would lead to the, I teach physics, I can't do everyday anti-racism kind of response. And so the need to say, actually anti-racism is just part of our work. It just is what we do all day or need to be doing, and not something we just take special time to do. So if you go to the next slide, Lloyd, I decided after doing these studies of everyday anti-racism use that I wanted to make a new tool to add to the toolkit. I think all of these tools, everybody's books are tools in the kit. I wanted to make one that would add a few things and take care of a few issues I had seen in studying everyday anti-racism in use. I was tired of these very common Venn diagrams. Diversity work is over here. My teaching of physics is over there. I wanted to be very clear about embedding anti-racism in all of the work of educating all day, every day. I actually went to the New Press, which had published Everyday Anti-Racism. And I said, I want to write a book now that's for people who wouldn't pick up a book called Everyday Anti-Racism. I wanted to embed anti-racism in the belly of the book so that people would end up doing anti-racism as if it was, of course, what we do. So in a sense, Schooltalk, which I went to next, is kind of a project of stealth anti-racism, even while I consider it an extremely explicit anti-racist book. And so there are pros and cons to that approach that I want to talk through now. So the next on-ramp I designed, if you go to the next slide, Lloyd, sorry, is Schooltalk. And I already mentioned the main things I was trying to do. And one thing that I did, and that I didn't realize I did, quite as monolithically in this project until after I had produced it, was I decided to embed anti-racism in the language of equity. Because of how universal it was during this time, there were offices of equity popping up all over the place. And the monolithic thing I didn't realize how much I did was that I do not use the actual word racism, I think, in this book. But I consider it an extremely anti-racist book. So there are pros and cons, like I said, to that decision. One of them being now all of a sudden people are looking for anti-racist books. And so I am having to do a little work for people who have not yet read Schooltalk to point out that it is a tool for everyday anti-racism. And I see it now almost like a prequel to everyday anti-racism, because it also includes a lot of foundational information that I taught when teaching the book, Everyday Anti-Racism, and I really felt educators needed to know hundreds of years of history, deep foundational info about myths about intelligence, about our inequality and its history and how it looks now. So there's things missing from Everyday Anti-Racism that are in Schooltalk. And also one thing I decided to add was more explicit invitation to personal self-inquiry. So there are a lot of think, discuss questions throughout this book, and a lot of sort of asking the reader to think about their own self, which I think was not quite as present in everyday anti-racism, which asked people to think directly about their actions. If we go to the next slide, Lloyd, that would be great. So the on-ramp here, I'm giving you a few slides that I actually use when I do professional development presentations on Schooltalk, even while I designed this book to be used without me. I didn't want to have to be flown around or now zoomed around or given money for keynotes or any such thing. I wanted it to be usable out the gate without me having to do anything. But I do introductions to it when asked. And so a few slides here from those kinds of introductions. The on-ramp here is getting people thinking critically. Our hook is getting people thinking critically about our treatment of young people in schools by critically examining the way we talk about them. So that is the hook. That is, that's how I'm getting you. That is the on-ramp. And it's precisely because it's not something that anybody can say is done by the specialists over there. Everybody talks. Everybody communicates all day in schools or fails to talk in key ways. And so getting us thinking critically about how we talk is the hook of Schooltalk. I also clarify that this book uses as its hook 20 years of my own work. I cite hundreds of other people's work in this book, but it turns our attention to a certain kind of talk in schools, so that for equity or anti-racism, other people are thinking really hard about improving our talk about content, how we talk rigorously about the subject areas, about how we, which language we speak in a multilingual nation. Schooltalk touches on those, but isn't really about either of those. It's really head on about how we talk about young people themselves. And I argue that this is where some of our most foundational problems arise. So that's where this book hooks in and invites your attention. So if you go to the next slide, Lloyd, thank you. So this book is really, like I said, it's just hundreds, probably thousands of examples from practice and research that really is trying to make a key theoretical point as well in our field, anthro-ed, and across the education field, that talk is action. It can be action, that the things we say or fail to say in schools have real implications for who gets which supports, which dollars, which teachers, which opportunities to learn, how young people are treated, how students come to feel about themselves. So this is, again, the hook for getting us doing anti-racism and not able to get away from it, is saying just how consequential our daily communications are. And I start this project, and also my PD, professional development, on Schooltalk, very explicitly by asking people to think about themselves and their own pasts. So that question in blue, and Schooltalk is filled with these think/discuss questions that can be used for personal reflection or a reflection in a group, asking people to think about, a way that a communication about them in K-12 help them or harm them. And the goal here in getting people sort of thinking about their own pasts, motivating comments from a teacher, crushing comments from a counselor, being not told they were not a math person, to say, nobody knew what I was going through, nobody knew my skills, things I could do. What I'm trying to do here is pull people into anti-racism through considering these very sort of common examples of human harm, and getting people to say, to resonate with examples of being mistreated, misseen, unsupported, in order to start to see how racism works on a daily basis in schools. So if you go to the next slide, get people thinking about, in Schooltalk, both what people say in schools and what we fail to say, which of course has been an interest and a focus of mine since writing Color Mute, and thinking about what people delete or don't say in schools. And again, I'm using examples of harm, often using, in fact, examples of harm to students of color that any reader can see as deeply harmful. This first one, think, discuss, I use as an example, a story from my colleague Daniela, who was told by a counselor that as a Latina student, she shouldn't bother applying to a top college because she just wasn't ever going to get there. And Daniela, in this case, defied that comment and went all the way through, I think, UC Berkeley to become a professor who I now work with, who gave me the story for use and actually uses it publicly. And she now studies how to get Latinx students to and through college. So an example of then going back to that counselor when she got her doctorate and saying, I never want you to speak that way to another young person, because she had seen so many young people hearing this same deflating, denigrating, distorting comment. So we want us thinking about what we say and its harms, and also what we fail to say. So I tell here the story of Jake, who was a Black student that I myself taught when I taught 10th grade English, and I saw him sitting on the stairs on graduation day, and he said he wasn't graduating. And I said, what do you mean? It's graduation day, you have all your graduation stuff. And he said, I just found out I don't have enough credits. We went to the counseling office together, had a conversation with the counselor. It turned out he had been told to get X credits. He got X credits, but he actually needed X+2 credits to graduate. We had a conversation, moved a work experience at the school into the credit column, and he graduated. The point I make here with educators is to point out that even a single conversation can change the trajectory of somebody's life, but also that, of course, we would have been far more helpful as a school community if we had had a running conversation about how Jake and lots of students who were students of color, low-income students almost exclusively in this school, how they were doing on their credits toward graduation, and beyond that toward college readiness, and that kind of structural crack in necessary communication, asking people to think about how they might add necessary information to a conversation in a school community where they work. This is where I want people, as we start using this on-ramp, this hook of thinking about our everyday communications and how harmful they can be and how necessary redesigning them is. And so at this point, people are ready to be what I'm calling in this project, equity designers who take charge of Schooltalk and redesign it. For equity, if you go to the next slide, Lloyd, I wanted to point out the sort of equity definition that I use in Schooltalk, and it has anti-racism embedded in it, which again is a choice for an on-ramp purpose. It has pros and cons. I have seen people get very invested in this definition of equity and sort of, in a sense, doing anti-racism without fighting it off. The phrase full human talent development is in here for an anti-racist reason, to combat the centuries of lies saying that some racial groups have more talents than others. This project also argues, and a point that comes right out of everyday anti-racism, that equity effort requires attention to the needs of groups and also to the needs of individuals, that both are necessary in providing the supports and opportunities young people need to succeed, which is our key sort of classic definition of equity in our field. And that our hook in this project is considering the pros and cons of our communications. I have seen this very welcomed by educators who have been really dying for, application suggestions, the same way people were in reading Everyday Anti-Racism. Some of the risk here is if anti-racism is too stealth, such that people, for example, skip in chapter 1 all of the deep grappling with race labels and just choose to go into grappling with other kinds of labels we use in schools. That is a risk of going in with an equity frame, while it also has some of the benefits of being able to put other kinds of experiences in schools in conversation. So if you go to the next slide, Lloyd, just real quick, and Lloyd, you can click around as I need you to, just to give you a glimpse of the domains of Schooltalk that this book covers. Each one of these is a chapter, pro and con. This book, unlike Everyday Anti-Racism, is designed to give you a lot of background and to actually have you read it in order, as opposed to being able to sort of cherry pick one little 3-page section out and only read that and never read the rest. It's designed to be read in full, which has pros because it's all there, but cons because we know that school communities are really busy and prefer the sort of quick conversation starter. But I'm trying to sort of flag 7 domains of school talk with real consequences that need our effort. And each one forces attention to racism and anti-racism, particularly to harms in this country to students of color and also along the lines of class. So in group talk, the first chapter, we turn our attention to the pros and cons of labels that we use in schools for young people. We ask questions like, are we using labels that misrepresent children? So the child being called Mexican in that quote there is actually from El Salvador. And what happens when we actually mislabel people and distort identities by using language that people themselves don't want used? We think about how labels designed to help actually can have very negative consequences, with many very racialized examples of this. Overrepresentation in special ed, if special ed is applied when a young person doesn't need such a label. LTEL, long-term English learner, at risk, labels sort of designed to help that can be very harmful if used to, again, distort young people's actual capacities, to mask their full skill sets, to the sort of packed with deficit. And each one of these is used in extremely racialized ways in schools. So chapter 1 goes through each of these. And it's really the first chapter is a strategic argument toward rejecting color muteness, or which is what I called color blindness in my first project, because we get ourselves thinking about how there's a gallop through 600 years of history in that project, in the chapter. And I really want people thinking, after I have warmed them up on at risk, on special ed, on LTEL, I want them grappling head on with race labels as social realities built on biological fictions, and that if we refuse to use these labels, we cannot describe the world we're in, nor our experiences of inequality in it. And so chapter 1 grapples with labels. Just speed up and go around, other domains of school talk that this on-ramp invites people to grapple with and then repair where they work, has to do with inequality talk, when our talk in schools glosses over all of the inequality in opportunity that young people actually experience and sums up people's outcomes with terms like grit. We look at how, if you click one more, I think you'll get to the term all students, Lloyd, which is all kids. I've been sort of grappling with the word all and its pros and cons since I was a graduate student, because sometimes it's essential for doing anti-racism and equity effort, and sometimes it masks all of the differences in experience, opportunity, and outcome. Smarts Talk is a chapter that gets us thinking about, if you click forward, Lloyd, thank you, about deep lies about intelligence and misconceptions about it that are pervasive in education and in our schools, and are particularly harmful to students of color. And there's a long section about sort of the particularly deep lie in US education that some race groups are smarter than others. And so chapter 3 is a very strategic grappling toward refusing that lie as well. Culture Talk gets us thinking about claims made about other people's communities and how they keep us from partnership with actual people by distorting communities that are actually often unknown, as well as disrespected by the speaker. Data Talk gets us thinking, and Rebecca, sounds like maybe you might want to use that chapter as well if you didn't, but about our data talk, all those spreadsheets, all of the stats and scores, and how often they really are filled with deficit thinking about students, but also just really misdescribe what young people can do. Life Talk gets us thinking about how schools are so often structured to never discuss the real lives of young people. And then Opportunity Talk gets us thinking about how often a discussion of opportunity in education communities leaves people out, and leaves out particularly both from information about opportunities available and input about how to improve opportunity, leaves out families of color, low-income families, English learning, or more recent immigrant families, et cetera. So that's school talk. I get people thinking, we're gonna click a little faster, Lloyd, about, if you go to the next slide, about very concretely about how everyday folks who intersect young people every day talk A risk here is that it, might leave people who make policy, who are the president, out of the analysis. And so I'm very careful in discussing this as, we're staying concrete with these examples about how Counselor X talks, but these are patterns throughout our field. If you go to the next slide. I have learned to say very explicitly that this project is not just about getting you to gaze more at your kids. It's about getting you to reflect on yourself, which is a point, that John Diamond's essay in Everyday Anti-Racism made a long time ago. The key equity move is reflecting on oneself, one's provision of opportunity, one's own biases, the supports I'm offering, the school we've set up, the system we have, and that Schooltalk is trying to get us to pay attention to each of those by using this hook, this on-ramp, questioning how we talk about students. Next slide is just an example of a slide. If you go back actually to group talk, a slide I might use in professional development where we grapple with real labels versus some key principles of equity-oriented school talk and get us grappling specifically with race labels. And then next slide, a sort of very explicit discussion model that's been forged over many years of teaching these kinds of tools is in Schooltalk. You see the principle, the strategy, the try tomorrow, the naming of core tensions, but then particularly designing improvements, this sort of, I've been really struck in seeing people use Schooltalk and excitingly, there's been a lot of people using it. So that's really rewarding. But I've been seeing how easy it is in our field to take even a book that's kind of obsessively oriented toward everyday action and then not apply it, just read it and talk about it. And so I wanted to share a study we did that really got us thinking about this. Here we have, in next slide, a study of folks in suburban Pennsylvania, had a small grant from the Spencer Foundation. In this case, literally everybody in this professional development in service was white. And anti-bias PD, which of course is increasingly being targeted at the federal level, is often not studied in real-time detail the way pre-service has been more. So that was part of what we wanted to do here, was get into looking at real-time professional development related to race and racism. One thing we noticed is that how easy it is, and we noticed it in ourselves as researchers, to default to really just the real-time conversation itself, and not to have higher expectations that work will be applied for change in schools. We noticed how easy it was to get really excited when we saw all these white teachers taking this on-ramp using Schooltalk and doing a lot of serious self-critique about their sort of teaching while white position in a district that was majority Black, and important self-critique was happening, important grappling. People were leaving saying, I would love to apply something like this. But what we realized was that nobody expected any application, not the PD facilitator. And we realized this in conversation with the PD facilitator, and not the district who paid for it either. That in a sense, just having nobody resist, we're so used to white teachers resisting PD in real time and in a sense, designing so they don't, which is a critique you could apply to me. But that we're so used to that being as low as our expectations can get that Andrew Matchiner and I, who wrote this article, are trying to say, can we raise our expectations a bit here to design professional development to expect application, which of course is how we know PD should be designed. We know that in the content areas that we don't want to just talk about issues. We want people to go try that way of teaching mathematics, come back, how did it go? Let's look at student work. That's the sort of more gold standard of PD. In the race field and anti-racism field, we may want to expect that kind of application too, going, trying, and coming back. And so the next slide, this is a glimpse, and Lloyd, I can leave these slides with you so nobody needs to try to type this right now, but I'm working on a sort of action planner that would be almost a note-taking sheet that people reading Schooltalk or any book that might get them into anti-racism could be asked to take notes about what am I taking away from this? What am I going to do next? I'm going to have a blank lines here. I'm going to fill them in with my results after I go try something and come back and I'm going to discuss my effort, but sort of designing for application is where I am now, PD that expects it. I want to finish. I plan for an hour. We have till 5:30. If you have to go, I am not offended. I want to have some dialogue, so I'm going to unfortunately rush through Us versus Hate, which is my most recent on-ramp. But I want to give you a glimpse. I'm very excited about this one as well. It is trying to have that double entendre there, us and US, in that I started designing this since 2016 and most explicitly after Charlottesville to invite anti-racism and other forms of what I'm calling anti-hate work in this on-ramp. Could you go to the next slide? I think we're not on our next slide. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Lloyd. Us versus Hate, designed for an era of exploding, explicit bigotry, unabashed racism, said without apology, exploding into the public realm and repeated by a government and government actors. This project is designed for that contemporary reality, and it's designed to be an on-ramp for teachers and also for young people to do very public, proactive, anti-racist communication. So this on-ramp is also designed for politically divided communities. So it's designed as a quote unquote nonpartisan effort, which is a core tension that I'll talk about in a moment with our research team grappling with, what it means to stay nonpartisan in this particular era. But we're trying to present a sort of, once again, on-ramp you cannot argue with unless you are for hate. This is an anti-hate project. And we are inviting youth people to make anti-hate messages. So if you go to the next slide, the design of Us versus Hate, we piloted this for like 3 years in the San Diego region, which is quite large and quite diverse politically, as well as other aspects of our demographics. And then Teaching Tolerance hosted a national scale up last year. And so we got to see people doing Us versus Hate from across the country, from city and small town Oklahoma, in Vermont, all over the country in a really exciting way, rural Texas, suburban Pennsylvania, et cetera. And now, after that national scale up hosted by Teaching Tolerance, Create and my national group Schooltalking are continuing to build it nationally. So very excited to continue to build this project, which has this kind of mechanism, trying to give tools. We made a website, usversushate.org, and I urge you to invite educators to participate this year. We have a December 11th first deadline for students' anti-hate messages. Usversushate.org has lessons that I curated from almost 20 national organizations that tackle racism, but multiple other, as you'll see, hate forms, as we are calling them. And the real mechanism that's different about this project, beyond lessons, which educators can choose to use or not use, they can just build on their own curriculum, it's inviting students to make public messages for their school communities, and then through a contest for the nation, for the giant public. And we're going with a theory of action here that's, back to that work on framing that I mentioned, that these sort of public communications can be a real invitation for others to join the work. So here are our anti-hate, go back, messaging goals. Thank you, Lloyd. I wanted you to just see the sort of hate forms that we are asking people to refuse in Us versus Hate. You can see that we invite messages in any medium. Many of ones I'm showing you glimpses of are posters and stickers that won our contest and were physically made and are now on school walls and on water bottles, et cetera. But we invite messages in any medium, which is an important aspect of today's youth production. I think importantly, as an on-ramp, Us versus Hate goes beyond really, sort of typical initiatives in schools that stop with bullying or kindness, to very explicitly name the isms and refuse those. You'll see it's intersectional in that we are putting anti-racism in combination with other isms experienced at the same time, as well as separately. We're unleashing this public commitment to sort of equal human value. And youth that we are doing data collection with and teachers have been saying that this mechanism is inviting conversations into their schools that had not yet occurred. So if you go to the next slide, you can see our first winner here of our first contest with a young person taking the anti-hate invitation straight to Ferguson in this case. And I want to flag here a potential con of using an anti-hate frame for dealing with racism particularly. And of course, it's the risk of treating racism just as the moments when people are screaming slurs and wielding torches in Charlottesville, the explicitly hateful bigotry version. The risk is turning people's attention away from our participation in very normalized harm, systemic harm that is also racism. So we did a lot of work. I did a lot of work with collective team of educators. We got input from young people. We got input from national orgs. Did a lot of work to define hate really deeply on purpose, rather than only letting people take it where they wanted. We wanted to do some advanced work to define what we meant by hate. So you'll see efforts, I've tried to circle some of them here, that are about trying to ask people to grapple with hate as a much deeper phenomenon, to think about beyond sort of slurs on the playground, to think about hate as moments when we repeat false ideas about inferiority and superiority, which is core to all of those normalized versions of racism we just went through in Schooltalk. Moments when we deny opportunity as if people are less valuable, moments when we are passive, and that gets us back to Beverly Tatum and active anti-racism, moments when we passively let harm happen to other people. We're saying that's hateful too. So we're trying to define hate in a very deep way in this project so that we're turning young people's attention to their own daily participation potentially in treating types of people as inferior because of their identities, and to say, I'm not doing that. The active anti-hate upstander actor. That's who we are inviting with this on-ramp into the work. And so what we're doing as researchers with our team at UCSD, we are exploring what people do with the frame. If you go to the next slide, little more advanced work was to sort of name some principles of anti-hate action. So you'll see more signals that I've tried to circle here. All of these are on the website. So this is a massive effort on my part and many colleagues at Create as well. But to create a website, write its text, hone its text, just as hard as any book I've ever written was making the Us versus Hate website itself so that its language would send people down the highway in ways that we hoped. And so you'll see some signals here related to trying to pull people into this through grappling with the explicit example, the explicitly hateful, refusing all the deep stuff, the normalized stuff, the systemic, the old stuff. So you see here 2 images. I like putting these next to one another because they came from the same classroom where a teacher taught a lesson about the Holocaust was one of its issues, and also standing up and refusing silence in the face of injustice. And you see 2 young people taking the invitation to now make an anti-hate message for Us versus Hate in very different, very important directions. And I see in these messages people refusing, as we hoped, any societal devaluation of types of people. And I would argue that that orientation is crucial to anti-racism, and it's crucial to any effort to equalize opportunity through policy, et cetera, is that active refusal. So just to finish with a few more examples from the project, if you go to the next slide, you see some examples of winners. I think it's important to flag that we have a youth voting process, and I have enjoyed watching youth pick deeper messages as winners. So we may think that, young people will just pick fluffy stuff about, just be nicer, or that they might pick sort of more explicitly colorblind material, we're all the same, but they actually have very sophisticated takes on racism as well as the other isms that we are grappling with in Us versus Hate. And I'm also really interested in, we are as a research team, how putting these examples together means that they live in conversation, such that a message refusing homophobia does live on the wall next to a message that says everyone belongs. Also interested in how the anti-hate frame is possible in schools. At different moments I have thought, shouldn't we be doing, us versus centuries of racialized disparities in wealth, right? I mean, there are other frames that we could use to get the work done, but Us versus Hate is very, it's a very youth familiar frame, and it's also something we just know is wrong. And so seeing people sort of grapple with each of these hate forms has been very important. If you go to the next slide, we're seeing anti-hate to get anti-racism sort of in the door of schools in important ways. We're seeing it be very motivational to young people. So we've had, beyond 8,000 students participate in this based on teacher reports in all kinds of demographic and political situations, and really excited to see where Us versus Hate goes next. The last content slide that I want to share is just to recognize our research team at UCSD and to flag a couple of issues we're tackling as researchers who are studying Us versus Hate participation through participant observation, through interviews, focus groups, through a questionnaire online. We're looking at how educators in a paper that we call What's Going On are grappling with teaching about current events and actual experiences of harm at a moment in history when government officials are saying the same things. And, teachers are supposed to be nonpartisan. We're not supposed to explicitly go after a specific party. That's what we mean. But we often expand that in education to mean, not mentioning politically fraught topics or critiquing any politician. And so it's a very complicated moment right now when you have government actors, including the president of the United States, using language that a 7th grader would be told not to use. And so what does it mean to do nonpartisan work? And then also, what does it mean, the deep irony of calling anti-hate work partisan? Because it actually sort of admits that government actors are speaking and acting hatefully. And so these core tensions for educators are really deep right now. And a lot of educators are sort of muzzling inclusion efforts to try to not be partisan. And that itself is a partisan act because it is, protecting sort of one party from critique. Very complicated moment. At the same time, students are saying schools should be places where we talk about all this. It's just what's going on. The second study, just to flag before I end, we have been moved by seeing teachers across the country assembling what we're calling backup to handle pushback. And this is not really about Us versus Hate. These are stories from throughout educators' careers. And these are stories that educators participating in Us versus Hate told us as they talked about, simply trying to keep inclusion on the agenda and keep the ability to discuss particular marginalized groups in our society or in a school empathetically. And so the forms of backup that educators are marshaling, whether it's stealth backup, we've seen educators, sending a book home with a young person quietly instead of putting it in the library, subspace backup, where educators are making special clubs to keep inclusion on the agenda, student-led backup following the lead of students who insist on talking about a given identity experience, and also educators learning to get backup from system leaders, school leaders, and systems, whether it's quoting laws or standards, but trying to keep inclusion on the agenda is just what we should be doing in schools. Okay, this is my last slide, just my next steps in designing new on-ramps. If you go to the next slide, Lloyd. I'm really interested in seeing what might happen if I combine all these. So as I have mentioned, Everyday Anti-Racism has been read by teachers, Schooltalk, mostly read by teachers, Us versus Hate, in Unleashing the Power of Youth. I'm wondering what would happen if youth read Schooltalk or Everyday Anti-Racism along with educators. and then made change in their schools collectively. So this is a picture of putting youth in the driver's seat, along with educators, of anti-racist change where they go to school. I did see one really interesting hole in the available on-ramps when I collected lessons for Us versus Hate from all of these national orgs. And it was that most of the lessons on racism that I received were about racism in society. So, you know, racism, racial profiling, racism in policing, wealth inequality, mascots, racial slurs, I mean, society examples. There weren't enough lessons about racism as it operates in school, beyond slurs, but to all the other things we just spent an hour talking about, who gets disciplined, who's called smart, who gets opportunity, et cetera. So I'm really interested in creating those youth-facing resources using the books I've written for educators, and then sort of putting it all together with youth and educators improving their schools simultaneously. So I'm going to stop there and go to the last slide where I invite questions, critiques. We have 15 minutes, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of a longer engagement among us. I have a Facebook group, the link is there. I have a hashtag I'm hoping to use with School Talking more. And then Us versus Hate. If each of you grabbed an educator that you know and invited them to our December 11th deadline, I would appreciate it, because the more messages we get, the more youth voices we can amplify, and we need those voices more than ever. So I'm going to pause and see if there are questions for me. And I think, Lloyd, you're going to field them for me, or they can go in the chat. You're facilitating, Lloyd.
Yes, put them in the chat, or raise your hand as a participant.
There are a number of hands already raised in the participant box.
Let's say, yes, Jamila.
Oh, I think that was from the earlier hand raise. Just didn't, they weren't cleared. I don't have a question, sorry.
No worries.
Ms. Jacobs, do you have a question?
That was from earlier.
Okay. Just going down the list, Amani.
Should we raise physical hands?
That would work, yeah, or put something in the chat. Or just speak up. Here's a question. How can parents be brought into this work?
Yes, there was one of the districts where I was just brainstorming about that last slide of putting all the on-ramps together is very interested in engaging families at the same time. So we were thinking about, having families read the same texts, having families participate in the same lessons. Us versus Hate has 2 lesson lists. One that is about building inclusive communities, and one that tackles specific hate forms, racism, xenophobia, et cetera, all the ones that I listed. And many of those lessons could be easily purposed for adult conversations, even as they're targeted for inviting youth into conversations. So I am very excited by this comprehensive vision of asking each of these key stakeholders to read some of these texts or participate in some of these lessons simultaneously. We've also seen some family groups and parents make messages for Us versus Hate, which has been exciting. I'm very interested also in the idea, I think our field in many ways is heading toward improvement teams, improvement science, improvement loops. And the idea of schools having teams that would take a book like Everyday Anti-Racism or Schooltalk, and teams that had family members on them, as well as youth, as well as educators, leaders, and teachers, et cetera. I think that could be some of the most powerful collaboration.
Let's see. From Rebecca, from your perspective and projects, what opportunities for youth engagement are revealed through distance learning and the pandemic?
I was very moved to meet a teacher from LA on what we've been having. One of my on-ramps are sort of informal Zoom meetups for educators, and trying to figure out how to design them and host them. And I mean, they're zoomed out, everybody's zoomed out. So, but I did have a meetup last week about us versus hate, and had an educator from LA who was talking about how important us versus hate was as a mechanism for learning during the pandemic. That there was a moment where, one of the hopes of us versus hate, and I didn't really mention it as we went through it, the us is designed to sort of glue together fractured school communities. And this sort of feeling of trying to build some kind of us felt particularly necessary. The need to speak one's mind, and the ability to do that publicly through a sort of public message invitation. This teacher was saying all of those elements were very important during distance learning, and that it was particularly valuable to invite young people to speak right now. And I've been reviewing some of his students' entries, which were submitted recently, which, now I understand they're made by youth stuck at home during the pandemic. And it's quite moving to see young people, in their little box, speaking their mind. Let's see here. Okay, yes.
There's a request to put the link to the action planner for PD that you mentioned in the chat.
Sure, let me see if I can grab it. Anybody want to ask a question while I'm grabbing it? I hope I can grab it. Let me see.
Question from Megan. What on-ramp would you recommend for educators who have been doing this work for a long time, who are in the fast lane, so to speak, who are feeling burned out, who feel like things have gone backwards lately?
Yeah, super important. I think, sustaining, it's funny, things have gone backwards lately. I'm wondering about, I don't know who asked a question about how long the lately is. I think a lot of, I mentioned teachers that I met in these summer meetups that I held. And there were a lot of people sort of thinking about sustaining energy after a sort of, very invigorated summer of reading with book groups from across the country, and then sort of, or in some cases planning, but I think more often reading, but finding kindred spirits. And then it was really a question of heading back into school communities where lots of people felt like the whole topic was off limits, it's not appropriate, we're not going to do it that way, and sort of there's like crashing and burning with, going back to school in a sense. And I think some of the motivator of youth energy that I mentioned is some of the potential solution here. I'm seeing educators sort of seeing us versus hate material and feeling reinvigorated. I wanted to show you, and I don't know if I can figure it out technologically, how to do it right this second, a video that maybe I will at the end, and then people can leave if you want, but a video a young person sent to explain his us versus hate message. He was from rural Washington State. And just watching this young person gave me a lot of energy. And I think there's something about tapping youth energy, not only in the way we're doing it in us versus hate public messaging, but for school improvement. And that's precisely, I think, what many young people, also coming off of months of protesting police brutality, want not only to make a dent in police brutality, but they want to work on the forms of racism they experience on a routine basis in schools. And so I think tapping youth is some of the prescription for burnout. I think it's also, as horrible as Zoom life is, it does afford connection to kindred spirits who work elsewhere. And I found in these meetups that there were you know, people who, I did role-alike meetups. So we met people who were all school leaders, but they lived in different places. They'd never met. They were all, you know, equity office leaders in districts. But this one is from this one part of Colorado, and this one is from this pretty different part of Colorado, you know, that kind of thing. And meeting people in similar situations and seeing that they were wrestling with similar things, and sort of, also having a place to talk about their school community, but not with their school community, was actually really important. So those kind of kindred spirit meetups, I think, is another potential place to go for additional energy. And then I think last thing is that I think in improvement work, we do want to rely on sort of, you know, people in the fast lane, in that we, you know, people with real energy, the teacher leaders, you know, we work with the go-getters all the time because they move systems, they know people, they have positive energy, but we also know people burn out, and that a lot of the work is really to bring in other people with us and not continue to rely on the same individuals over and over and over. And so I think bringing in more people to the work is also part of the prescription. So it's 5:25 on a long day. Shall I take one more question?
Here's a good one.
Okay.
As a parent, I continue to wonder, as you seem to be, about the language of anti-hate. Hate has its place, as I think you might agree, or so it seems when I find myself talking to my children about when we are justified in our rage, when reaching for violent acts are justifiable and just, and so on. Even Gandhi advocated violence despite the West's fetishizing of his nonviolent position. What might you say to parents like me who are reframing what teachers are telling our kids at school about the role of hate or violent action, protest at not progress?
That's a great question to end on. You know, this is, this is the risk of using the anti-hate frame as on-ramp, in that, you know, it's a very familiar term and people take it where they take it. And some people might take it to just be kind, while other people take it to very deep, you know, work against homophobia, and other people take it to, you know, very deep work against racism, et cetera. We tried really hard in defining hate as it, you know, you saw it as it went along there, but as anytime people denigrate or harm people as if their identity makes them an inferior type of person. And so to me, that does not cover the rage of protest. It does not make hateful teaching about white supremacy and the facts of it. It does not sort of make it hateful to have a real critique of racial inequality and its realities. And so to me, again, the task is designing the on-ramp to define the terms that we're asking people to use. And then in Us versus Hate's case, as I mentioned, young people voting on messages are also lifting up the messages they find most powerful. And a lot of them are angry or are very serious protest. And this is, I think it's all in how we use all of these terms. And of course, I think the last thing I'll say is that I think for any of us dealing in language and trying to get anti-racism done, anything we say in any term we offer can be weaponized and used in the wrong way. You know, ask Martin Luther King, right? And so I think, you know, continuing to struggle with language and these on-ramps and pulling people into, you know, I guess I would say sort of serious anti-racism is what we're trying to do. So I want to thank everybody for inviting me. And I know we wanted that, I'm having trouble lifting the, I apologize, from the slides I have on my screen, I'm having trouble lifting the note-taking sheet that I mentioned, the action planner. So what I will do is share the slides that have the link on it, or you can just email me, micahpollock@ucsd.edu, and I'll send you whatever you want. Thank you so much for inviting me to your community. Thank you, Dean Carter. Thank you, faculty, and thank you, students. And I hope that we stay in touch and find one teacher and bring them into Us versus Hate before December 11th.
Well,
Thank you so
Micah,
much.
the
Yes.
thanks and the gratitude comes from us. We so appreciate your taking the time to speak to the community today. So we appreciate everything. Thank you for such a rich and informative talk. And we hope to see you again. Come back anytime.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.